further ado, let's go to our presentation. It's going to be by, as I said, my colleague Anthony Bridge. He's our analyst at the Centre for Cities. He leads on all our planning and housing activity and work, and he's going to give us an overview of the work that we've been doing, looking at the role of suburbs within the current planning system and how the planning system needs to be developed and changed in order to get more out of more suburbs. So Anthony, over to you.
Great, thanks Andrew, and thanks everyone for tuning in today as I talk you through a recent paper which I co-authored with my colleague Eleanor Magrini. So let's just see if this works. Great. So the title of the report is The Sleepy Suburbs, and it's trying to answer what really is the role of the suburbs in supplying new homes to tackle the housing crisis. And I'm going to talk you through kind of an introduction, a bit of a context to the report, followed by looking at kind of what is the real pattern of housing supply within cities, then an explanation for why we see those patterns, and then setting out what needs to change in order to increase housing supply in the existing suburbs. I think if there's one thing everyone should really take away from this session, it's really this kind of chart here, which is kind of a neat description of the problem which we've identified. And there's really this combination between the way the local plan process works, political opposition to new housing, and the housing targets which are set for local authorities by central government, which means that new housing kind of flows down a path of least resistance, that it either flows down to city centres or town centre locations, if there are suitable sites in those places. It might flow down to the outskirts of cities, kind of new greenbelt locations or new urban extensions, but new houses are very, very rarely built within the existing suburbs, to the extent that about half of our suburban neighbourhoods contributed to about 2% of all new houses built in England and Wales since 2011. And I'll talk you through the reasons why that is. Really kind of the context of this research is it's following on from a piece which we did in the middle of last year called Capital Cities, which found that between cities, there's really no connection between the supply of housing and the demand for housing. So what this chart sets out is on the bottom axis, we've got the supply of housing from 2011 to 2019. And then along the vertical axis, we've got the housing affordability ratio, which we could take as a measure of demand for housing back in 2011. And it really doesn't matter so much what measure you take as a proxy for demand, whether you use house prices or the housing affordability ratio or resident wages. In every case, you kind of get a scatter graph that looks like this. There's kind of a fuzzy cloud where there's not much of a relationship between supply and demand. So there's places like Brighton up here in the top left corner, which is very, very expensive, which has very, very high demand, but really builds very, very little housing. And there's also places which are kind of the reverse, where places like Wakefield, which have much more affordable and arguably less demand for housing, are building far, far more than these expensive places. Now, our explanation for this is that it's the planning system which contributes to this disconnect between cities and their supply and demand for housing. But if that's true, we reasoned that the planning system must also be disconnecting the supply of housing within cities as well. And this is what we aim to do with this research. So I'm going to set out for you that there's a general pattern of housing supply within cities, and there's variations on that pattern, which we'll go through. But across all of our cities, that there are definitely some things that they all have in common. And I'm first going to show you Leicester as kind of a very average example of a city. So Leicester has fairly average housing supply and also average affordability as well. And what this map shows is the supply of housing by neighbourhood, by kind of a lower super output area since 2011. And I think it quickly becomes clear that there's at least 3 different areas within the city. You've got the city centre here towards the right of the map, which is seeing very, very concentrated, intensive bursts of supply, which that'll include student flats, that'll include office conversions, new luxury apartments, quote unquote, and those are being delivered quite considerably in Leicester city centre. You've also got some sites on the outskirts here, so towards the right, the left of the map, and towards the south, and a little bit over here towards the right as well. And these are new urban extensions. So these are new housing estates built by the volume house builders. And also these houses tend to be kind of quite car dependent. So they'll be often on the outskirts of cities. But what we can see here, there's this kind of third area as well between the city centre and between the outskirts, which is the existing suburbs. And we can see that the height and the colour of these neighbourhoods corresponds to the supply of housing within them. So actually these palest neighbourhoods here have actually built zero houses actually since 2011, whereas these kind of darkest green neighbourhoods have built about 25 houses per year since 2011. So we can see there's this very binary divide between the existing suburbs and the city centre and the outskirts as well. So first I'm going to go zoom into Brighton first as an example of a city which is very, very expensive and very, very unaffordable, but also is not really building that much. So there's really a disconnect here between supply and demand. And I think we can immediately see that there's a big difference here between Leicester and Brighton as well, in that although we've got a kind of small concentration of supply within the city centre, and over here as well within Shoreham town centre and the neighbouring Ada local authority, there's really not much new housing being supplied on the outskirts of Brighton. Now, that's partly because Brighton has these very kind of tight topographical constraints. It's tied in by both the coast and also by the South Downs to the north. But Brighton doesn't seem to really make up for this by building much more in the existing suburbs. And we can see this as well when we zoom in to look, if we turn the map 2D and we focus on, we can pick out some individual neighbourhoods and infrastructure, such as train stations and railway lines. We can see that it doesn't really seem to be an infrastructure problem either, that there are plenty of train stations such as this one here towards the top right of the map, and here between the boundary between Ada local authority and Brighton and Hove local authority, which have connections towards the city centre and existing railway infrastructure, simply aren't providing much new housing. So even though Brighton is one of the most unaffordable cities in the country, where houses cost 14 times average wages, the housing supply in Brighton has grown by far less than the average, only by about 3% since 2011. Now, if we compare that to, say, somewhere like Wakefield, Wakefield we see, a quite different pattern. So the city centre for Wakefield is actually towards the top left here, and again we can see a kind of small concentration of housing supply within Wakefield city centre. But actually, there's large kind of areas across the kind of urban form of Wakefield, which are providing very concentrated amounts of new supply. And these include or primarily new urban extensions, new housing estates on the outskirts of Wakefield, which are providing in this city a much greater than average supply of housing than the average for cities in England and Wales. So even though the average city built about 6% growth in housing supply from 2011 to 2019, Wakefield saw about 8% growth over that period. And that's because you've had these very concentrated areas of supply within Wakefield's urban form. But even despite that, you can still see over here towards the left of the map that there are still many neighbourhoods which are building very, very little. So again, we've still got these kind of very pale neighbourhoods here, which are building zero houses, and these neighbourhoods as well, which is the second palest colour, which are building less than one house every year. So even though kind of Wakefield is an above average city in terms of housing supply, we've still got a situation where about a third of the city is still building less than one house a year. So if we then kind of think about a city, well, what about cities which are very expensive, but which are actually supplying lots of new housing? We can take a city like Exeter as a good example of that. And Exeter is very, very different again to Brighton, which we saw earlier. So even though both Exeter and Brighton are on the coast, and even though they're both very expensive cities, Exeter's responds really quite differently. So while Exeter has kind of a large concentration of supply within the city centre, it also has on Exeter's outskirts a large area in which very, very concentrated new supply of housing is being provided. So if we, again, kind of take a 2D look at Exeter, we can see that this is partly due to the provision of new infrastructure. So New Court railway station towards the bottom right of the map is a new railway station which was put in by Network Rail, and new housing has been supplied around this train station in order to support the infrastructure to support those new houses. But we can also see that, like Brighton and like Wakefield as well, there are still large parts of the existing urban form which are building very, very little new housing. So we can see across here, like just north of the city centre, south of the city centre as well, there are large parts in which no new houses or very, very few new houses are being built. And that includes areas which are quite close to existing infrastructure as well. So such as this train station here, towards the middle of the map, and down towards Digby and Soughton as well. So, that's generally the pattern that we see across cities which are building a quite considerable amount of housing, is that they have very, very concentrated kind of areas in which lots of new houses are being built, but large parts of the rest of the city remain off limits. So we actually see a slight variation on this pattern with cities like Manchester, for instance, and this is looking at Manchester's primary urban area, so it's Greater Manchester minus Wigan, but you can see a pattern which is resembles Exeter in some ways, but it's marked particularly by a very, very large concentration of housing supply within Manchester city centre. So the amount of houses in Manchester city centre has increased by about 25% from 2011 through to 2019. And we've actually seen that on the outskirts of the city centre, we're seeing lots of new houses being built as well. So we're actually seeing an outwards expansion of the city centre into the rest of the Greater Manchester area as well. But even though Manchester city centre is providing lots of new houses, Manchester's supply of new housing was actually below the average for cities in England and Wales. So while the average city saw around 6% growth in housing supply, Manchester saw about 5% growth in housing supply. And that's because so much of the existing suburbs of Manchester are building almost no new housing at all. And we can see that although there are kind of pockets of new supply, such as Bury up here, and this is Bolton and Bury up here. There are pockets of supply within the suburbs which are providing new high-density town centre developments. Large parts of the rest of the existing urban form of Manchester are not providing much new housing at all. This can also be seen more clearly in the 2D map as well, that while we have there are some kind of connections and some links to existing infrastructure, such as motorway junctions and train and tram stations as well, there are large parts of the city which are well served by infrastructure currently, but which aren't currently adding any more new houses at all. London exhibits a kind of similar pattern to Manchester in some ways. So this is again looking at the primary urban area of London, which includes kind of some local authorities which are outside the GLA but are really kind of part of the urban form of London. And we can see again a pattern which is very, very similar to Manchester. So very, very concentrated supply in the city centre, and the kind of pockets on the outskirts, pockets throughout the suburbs as well. And this is driven in part by how individual local authorities often face very strict kind of housing targets that they themselves have to fulfil. In combination with the overall housing need that London as a city requires. So you can actually see that this column here, this is actually the Olympic Park, which has provided about 5,500 new homes since 2011, and that's about 700 homes a year. So it's the most intensive supply of any neighbourhood in the country. But we can also see neighbourhoods here like we've got North Greenwich here, you've got Canary Wharf, here Wembley as well, Nine Elms down here as well. So there's a few of these kind of pockets of very high density supply across London. But again, like Manchester, if we zoom in and take a 2D look just at the east end of London, we can see that although there are these areas, such as the Olympic Park, such as North Greenwich, such as Eltham and Castle, which is supplying very, very concentrated amounts of new supply, large parts of the rest of the city are supplying practically no housing at all. And this includes areas which are kind of very, very well connected to infrastructure that can take people right into the heart of the city very, very quickly. So really what this shows is at least two different things. The first is that actually large parts of our urban form across the country are dormant. And the definition which we use for dormant is that neighbourhoods which are building kind of less than one house every year. And we find that about half of all neighbourhoods in the suburbs in our cities are dormant, that they're making no contribution to new housing supply whatsoever. So that they're contributing to about 2% of all new houses, even though they make up only about 50% of our cities. But the other factor is that the neighborhoods which are supplying very, very intensive amounts of new housing, so more than 25 houses every year, even though they're just 4% of all neighborhoods in the UK, they're supplying 45% of all new housing within cities in the UK. So there's this great imbalance between, on the one hand, there are neighborhoods which are pulling far more than their weight in terms of the supply of new housing, and there are many other neighborhoods as well which are not doing their fair share when it comes to new housing supply. Now, if we take a step back and we think about this, it's not necessarily a problem that cities which build more housing make a greater contribution to the supply of new housing, but we find that the degree to which cities have these very, very intensive neighborhoods really, really matters for their overall housing supply as well. So if we go back to a kind of Exeter-Brighton comparison, where both are expensive cities on the coast with very high demand for housing, about 11% of all neighborhoods within Exeter meet this intensive definition. So they're building more than 25 houses a year. And those intensive neighborhoods make up about 70% of all new housing supply within Exeter. And that amounts to about an 8% growth in the housing supply of Exeter as a city. If we take somewhere like Brighton, so even though Brighton has about a similar share of the city's urban form as dormant, is really not building very much, the lack of new and intensive housing, new intensive neighborhoods within Brighton is much more marked. So if rather than 11% of all neighborhoods being intensive, only 2% are in Brighton. And that really contributes to Brighton's really slow housing growth of 3% from 2011 to 2019. So the lack of kind of intensive neighborhoods within our system is very, very important for explaining these trends. So why is it that we see these patterns? Like, it's not necessarily the case that in other countries that kind of such intensive supply is crucial for meeting housing targets, but it really does seem to be the case in cities in England and Wales. And we've come up with a number of explanations, but I think the primary one which we would give would be the role of a discretionary planning system and how the NPPF, the National Planning Policy Framework, currently works. So currently, for cities to meet their housing targets, they need to allocate sites and ensure that they have an adequate land supply to provide new houses in the near future. But those sites are very, very rarely allocated in existing urban areas. So when regarding development in the existing suburbs, local plans rely on windfall sites that come forward by speculative developers. But the way the discretionary planning system works, it's very uncertain in nature. Its lack of rules and predictability makes this very, very uncertain for developers. So think about it from a developer's perspective. If you want to kind of buy 2 or 3 houses and knock them down and put up kind of a mid-rise apartment building in its place, you first have to spend time and money searching for 2 or 3 adjacent houses next to each other who are willing to sell. You have to spend time and money acquiring the properties. You have to spend time and money then kind of designing a scheme which will fit that particular site. And you then have to spend time and money negotiating, navigating through the planning process. And you might still receive a rejection in your planning permission. So there's an enormous amount of upfront costs facing developers in our discretionary planning system, which make existing development in the existing suburbs too risky. There are also ways in which the tax system functions, in which it makes it particularly unattractive for developers to provide mid-rise apartment buildings. So the way that Section 106 works is that the requirements for affordable housing frequently kick in when you build 10 units or more, which make building houses or developments of 10 units or more particularly unprofitable for developers. And developments to meet housing targets is simply easier in city centres and outskirts. So the land assembly is often simpler. It requires less effort from local authority planners per house to provide to meet the housing targets and provide new dwellings. And there's also frequently less political opposition to building in the existing building in city centres or in the outskirts rather than in the existing suburbs. And in combination, this takes us back to the chart which we saw at the beginning, which is that there's this combination of kind of institutional design factors in our planning system, political opposition to new housing in the existing suburbs, and the kind of housing targets which are calculated and set by MHCLG, which mean that housing or new homes then flow to the place of least resistance. So in somewhere like Manchester, for instance, the path of least resistance is to build new houses in Manchester city centre and in certain town centre locations such as Bolton and Bury. In somewhere like Exeter, maybe the path of least resistance is primarily those kind of new urban extensions which we saw towards the right of the map. But across all of our cities, very, very few new houses are provided in the existing suburbs. So, you might be wondering at this point, well, so what, right? Is this necessarily a big problem? So long as we keep building in the city centres and we keep building on the outskirts, what's the big deal if we don't see that much development in the existing suburbs? Well, it means we do face kind of much more efficient land use, and it means that there's a real kind of break on housing supply within our cities. We could be building more, but we currently do not. Now, to kind of get a sense of like what's the size of the prize, like if we could kind of pass a reform which would increase housing supply within the existing suburbs, we do have to consider those real constraints which we discussed earlier. That it is not reasonable to expect kind of massive densification of our suburbs, but it's also not really worth pursuing a politically risky reform unless it actually does increase housing supply by a large amount. So we built a scenario where we kind of imagined what would be the kind of the outcomes from a large but kind of conservative and small scale increase in housing supply within the suburbs. Excuse me. Excuse me. So the example we gave was a city like Derby, where overall kind of supply in the suburbs was about 3%. And again, kind of like that pattern we saw in places like Exeter, most of Derby's neighbourhoods built far less than that 3%. They actually built, excuse me, excuse me, got a bit of a frog in my throat. So about 82% of suburban neighbourhoods in Derby built less than 3%. So we built a model in which we imagined, okay, what if every suburban neighbourhood in Derby built at least at that suburban average? So everyone is brought up to about the 3% average. If the neighbourhoods are building at 4, 5, 6 or 10%, they're left alone. But every neighbourhood is building at least at 3% level. And what that means in practice is really about, at least 3 houses a year, at least 4 houses a year, depending on the neighbourhood. And this is the impact which we calculated that would have if you repeated that, bringing every suburban neighbourhood up to the average across the country. So we'd see an extra 300,000 homes. Excuse me. We would meet almost meet the 300,000 homes a year target set by central government by building an extra 56,000 houses a year. And across most of our cities, that would see an increase in new housing supply by roughly around 50%, but increasing up to upwards of 80% in places like Milton Keynes. So this would be, even though there's kind of a very, very small change within each individual neighbourhood, altogether, because so much of our cities are not building any new housing at all, even a small change in every single neighbourhood would actually result in a very large increase in total housing supply in these cities. And the consequence of that would be that there would be no more dormant neighbourhoods within our cities in England and Wales. So even though intensive neighbourhoods would remain and still continue to play an incredibly important role in supplying housing within our cities, under this scenario where every neighbourhood is building at least 3, at least 4 houses a year, there would be no more dormant neighbourhoods which are building less than 1, almost by definition. And I think this chart in particular helps set out really what kind of one of the core findings of the report is, which is that sometimes the debate can get a bit stuck or bogged down in, we should densify the suburbs or we should kind of build on the green belt. And really what this shows is that it's not a case of either or, that if we want to tackle the housing crisis, we need to build more in the suburbs and we need to build more on the green belt as well. We need to introduce more land supply into the system to allow development in places where there is demand for new housing. And there's really no other way out of the housing crisis apart from that. So what needs to change? We've diagnosed the problem, but what are the ideas and what are the solutions to fix it? So we've separated these out into 3 different types of reform, some which would increase total supply, some which would increase suburban supply specifically, and some experimental ideas as well. And our kind of big core recommendation is that there really needs to be a shift from our current discretionary permission-based planning system towards a much more flexible and rules-based zoning system, such as in parts of the United States or Japan as well. and this should reduce the risk for developers and increase the predictability of the planning process for everyone involved. And what that would mean then is if you, as a developer, you propose something which complied with the zoning and complied with the building regs, it legally must be granted planning permission by the local authority. Another way you could do that without such a large reform of our system would be to increase the scope of permitted development, such as through upwards extensions as the government is currently considering. And you could also intensify the price element in calculating the housing targets. There is currently an affordability weighting within the calculation of housing targets. That should be much stronger to increase the role of price signals within the planning process. In terms of reforms that can make suburban supply easier, we think that the National Planning Policy Framework should encourage cities to allocate some sites or provide some predictability about development in the existing suburbs. There really needs to be some kind of policy support for densification in the National Planning Policy Framework. It's not clear at present how cities can present plans to the Planning Inspectorate which can reliably increase housing supply within the existing suburbs. We think that public transport accessibility level scores, which is something that London has, to indicate where places which have very good transport infrastructure and can support more new housing should be rolled out across the other metro mayors as well. So Manchester currently has one, but the other metro mayors should have them as well. Things like suburban design guides, like Croydon has currently recently implemented, to increase the predictability of the planning process and show to developers that if you comply by these design rules, then you'll be much more likely to get a favourable response in the planning system for suburban development. We think that the Section 106 system is far too unpredictable and discretionary and should be replaced with a flat 20% levy on development. And we also think that the way the new homes bonus, which is a kind of a tranche of funding which goes to local authorities which provide new houses, in an attempt to better align the incentives so that local authorities are rewarded for taking political risks to supply new houses, that should recognise the greater political risk that building in existing suburbs entails. And so there should be a double bonus for new homes which are built in the existing suburbs. And there should be more funding for planning departments in cities. That suburban development by its very nature is trickier, it's more bespoke, and planning departments and local authorities across the country don't have the resources currently to provide the kind of bespoke treatment that these sites need within our system. And I think there's a couple of experimental ideas as well, which have been proposed and should be tried within our current framework. A reform that's been quite successful in California recently has been the introduction of kind of granny flats or millennial pads as annexes and back gardens, and these are essentially allows for permitted development rights in the back gardens of houses in California. They're called accessory dwelling units, but they now make up a very, very large amount of supply in California. And obviously that's contingent upon the size of backyards in the United States, but that's something we're considering for here as well. And also we really think that the government should be trying London NIMBYs ideas, which are essentially by devolving land use decisions to a very local level, such as a street or a block, you change the incentives for the residents of that street from opposing new housing to supporting new housing and capturing the uplift in prices that densification allows. And that could be done today with local development orders. So that's everything. Thanks everyone for listening, and yeah, looking forward to hearing your questions and comments.
Excellent, thank you. Thank you very much, Anthony.
Oh, Andrew, you're on mute. Oh.
Apologies for that. Thank you for that. And lots to digest, lots to think about. The questions have started to roll in, but keep the questions coming throughout, and we'll take them one at a time. And I'll come to you in a minute and ask you to pose your question, and then Anthony can reply. But before we do that, I'm just going to ask Ivan Tennant, who's an associate planning director at GL Hearn, has been working with us on on this particular piece of research, to just give us a very brief response, and particularly focusing on, what he sees as the sort of operational or planning system challenges if we were going to move to a system that Anthony was proposing. So, Ivan, over to you.
Yeah, thanks, Andrew, and thank you very much, Anthony. I mean, it is a fascinating piece of work, which I think Centre for Cities needs to be commended. I think it really touches a live nerve for planners and all those involved with trying to overcome the housing crisis. And I think perhaps the most sort of telling point for me is that cities need to be firing on all cylinders. They need to be looking at the green belt. They need to be looking at their city centres. We need to be looking at new settlements in order to provide the housing that we need. But we also need to be looking at some of these more complex brownfield locations, and I think that's in line with the drift of national policy. I think essentially the kind of where the planning balance should be weighted between addressing the economic needs of cities. That is to say, ensuring cities have access to a strong enough supply of labour to sustain economic growth, while also preserving residential neighbourhoods, is very much a contemporary topic, and I think it's something this piece of work looks at in quite an interesting way. There's no question that the most far-reaching of the policy ideas that Anthony's outlined, if introduced, do have the potential to fundamentally reshape our cities. As Andrew was saying, I've been asked to just comment briefly on the practicalities of implementing some of these reforms based on the experience that GL Hearn has in working with councils to understand not only the what of housing, that's to say how many homes, the proportion of affordable homes, how many affordable homes are required, but also the how. And I hope Alistair Parker is in the room, a colleague of mine from our development team, who I'm sure will be able to bring some interesting insights in terms of the second question, the delivery of housing, particularly in complex urban sites. I mean, there are a number of policy ideas that have been put forward, from those that I think will have a relatively minor impact, to those that, as I say, will have the potential to reshape our cities. I think the two that have the greatest potential, but are also, I think, potentially the most problematic, the shift of the planning system towards the flexible zoning system, the discretionary system, away from the discretionary system that Anthony was describing, to a more rules-based approach, but also the intensification of the price element in the calculation of housing need. I mean, these are clearly the two most powerful levers that the study offers for ramping up the market mechanism. That is to say, addressing the disconnect between the demand for and the supply of homes that the report very articulately demonstrates, and that Anthony introduced us to. I mean, just considering the first of those two, the shift to the rules-based system, I mean, this will clearly require a careful rescoping of the plan-led system, in particular to ensure that democratic legitimacy is not lost in the process. I think a good example is in Germany, where a similar system is used. But in Germany, the government has far more power to deliver change by acquiring sites and capturing land value in order to ensure that adequate infrastructure and affordable housing is delivered. As a result, the system is trusted. A system that removes the current institutional safeguards at the local level without complementary reform to ensure the public interest is protected, I would be concerned would fall quickly into disrepute. As regards the second idea, increasing the multiple applied within the standard method for arriving at housing need, this is going to be a very politically challenging change to make, certainly in the short term. Obviously, the current standard method does have a cap in place, specifically so as to limit the impact on housing targets in areas of high demand. I I suppose there is an issue to do with, therefore, the speed at which such a reform could be introduced. And I'd be extremely interested to hear from local authorities representatives in the room. But my suggestion is that it could be introduced, but only incrementally and following a substantial transition period. I mean, local authorities are required to update their local plans every 5 years. This does offer an opportunity to introduce the reform within the current plan making cycle. The change to the multiple could be reflected in gradual uplifts to the land supply trajectory over the 15-year lifetime of the local plan. This will give councils the time to deliver infrastructure to unlock sites, find the necessary funding, and deliver the leadership to deliver change at this scale. So those are just some thoughts on some of the more, as I say, far-reaching and potentially impactful policy ideas that the study puts forward.
Excellent. Thank you very much indeed, Ivan. So let's turn to questions. So when you get ready to unmute your mic to ask your question, and the first question I'm going to ask is going to come from Jacob Bournehill, and he picks up this question about land assembly. So Jacob, I'm going to come to you, unmute your mic, ask your question or make your point, and then Anthony will respond. And then I'm going to come to Caroline Dibden as well, who's got a kind of question about how we might need to further incentivize suburban development relative to edge of town, out of town, or greenfield kind of stuff. So without further ado, Jacob, are you there? Just give us your question.
Hi, yes. Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Fantastic. Hi, Andrew. So yeah, Jacob Bournehill. I'm a planning consultant. Previously worked in the public sector for a number of years, Birmingham City Council, Westminster Combined Authority. My big questions around land assembly. Building more in the suburbs means primarily acquiring occupied properties. These are people's homes, and particularly in the more attractive suburbs. And so you can allocate a site, but unless you can actually assemble the land, you're not going to bring development forwards. And while you have got CPO powers, they are obviously controversial, and I don't think many authorities are going to want to CPO a whole row of houses to, increase density on the streets. Rare occasions, something like Commonwealth Games, you might do it, and I know Birmingham City Council currently are doing that, but generally it's that land assembly issue. And so it's not the analysis showing that actually what's happening is that suburbs aren't delivering new homes because these areas are actually well occupied.
Yeah.
That makes sense.
Lovely, great. Jake, thanks very much, Jacob. Anthony?
Yeah, so that's definitely an element in it, this land assembly problem. And that seems to be a really kind of intrinsic aspect of suburban development that we see around the world, that assembling the properties for the development to take place is a major kind of barrier to development proceeding, even in cities with or even in countries and systems with very, very different ways of planning. I think what Jacob's kind of comment kind of touched a little bit on what's the role for the public sector and what's the role for the private sector as well. And this is kind of part of the reason why I support kind of moving towards a much more flexible zoning system, is the fact that currently in a discretionary planning system, because it's so uncertain, if you want that land assembly to take place, you need the public sector to be at the front of that land assembly process. And that might happen. As you mentioned an example in Birmingham there as well. It's happened before, especially during the 20th century, but it's politically controversial. So I think if we want to kind of increase housing supply in the suburbs in a kind of natural way without kind of getting into political conflict with residents, we need to kind of think about how we change the institutional design of the planning systems to allow it.
Okay, very good. Caroline Dibden. Caroline, get ready to unmute. You've got a question, particularly in relation to the price component in the calculation of the housing requirements. So, Caroline, unmute and ask a question.
Hi, hopefully this is working.
It is.
Whether it is. Yeah, it's a concern that I think the law of unintended consequences might happen if you just increase the pricing component in the calculation for housing need in the standard method. I'm an ex-councillor in Hampshire. I'm also on the South Downs National Park committee for planning, not anymore, but I was. My view is that what you would see is just significantly more pressure if you do that, if you up the local housing need numbers because of the pricing component, for pressure for greenfield and urban extensions outside the city boundaries, because it's just simpler and easier for most developers and most councils to do that as well. So unless you combine it with some significant either reward or compulsion to intensify or build in the suburbs, I mean, particularly around transport hubs, I think you're just then going to end up with an exacerbation of what Anthony was showing in his diagrams.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Caroline. And the points you make have been touched on by other questions, not least from Megan from Sustrans and others around the kind of different pressures. So Anthony, your reflection on that, introducing the price mechanism more, giving it more prominence, just exacerbates the current patterns rather than ameliorates them.
Yeah, I think Caroline's completely right in that it would, if you changed nothing else about the planning system and how it worked, you would probably see outcomes similar to, as she sets out, you would see an intensification of this pattern between more city centre development and more kind of development on the outskirts as well. That's why we suggest kind of combining these ideas together to create both an increase in supply in places which have a very tough and a very tight housing crisis, and also making suburban supply easier as well. I think on this, it's not necessarily a bad thing for cities for this kind of development on the outskirts to take place. It's very natural for cities to expand and to grow. And if we think about cities like London and Manchester as well, which have very, very tight green belts around them, part of the problem which they face is even though they're building lots in the city centre, and even though they're building lots in their town centre locations, they don't have enough land supply in their system to keep housing affordable because they're not building on the outskirts like cities like Exeter are. So it's not one or the other. I think we need to be thinking about everywhere in cities where we can build housing.
Okay, excellent, very good. Thank you very much. We've had several questions related to permitted development and permitted development rights and some concerns. Paul Newman, Paul, I know you've asked a couple of questions. You asked a question around permitted development. Can you just say something about pose that question to Anthony? So Paul Newman,
yes,
you're up.
That's me.
There you are.
Yes, it struck me that this being the land of the loophole and moral hazard, just an observation about permitted development, there's been abuse in some boroughs in London where basically vacant office buildings have been converted into substandard rental accommodation with no comeback from the local authority because it is permitted development, and therefore an extension of the concept might be prone to more extensive abuse. And I just wondered whether you had a comment on that. Okay, very good. Thank you very much. Anthony, PDR.
Yeah, so I think on PDR, there's kind of a lot of controversy around kind of the quality of these buildings, these new kind of office conversions that we've seen, not just in London, but also in places like Crawley, Basildon, Slough as well, where they've also all been very common. I think that there have been specific concerns around the fact that building regulations for residential properties have not been applied to permitted development properties, as well as kind of the relaxation of minimum space standards in London, which have been also been controversial. I'm very concerned about the building regulations side of it, not so much the minimum space standard, as we've discussed in other work. But I think what's really interesting about permitted development is that if you look at where these office conversions have taken place, it is overwhelmingly in the Great South East of England. So you've got this much, much closer supply connection between the demand for housing and the supply of housing through a non-discretionary kind of essentially kind of flexible planning system. And that's really the problem at the heart of the housing crisis, is that we don't have this connection between housing supply and housing demand. Now, within our system, the kind of the shortcuts to get to that outcome would be through permitted development. But I think reforms which are similar and which can close some of those loopholes you mentioned, but would require bigger and institutional change, that's the kind of solution which we need to fix the housing crisis for good.
Okay, I'm conscious of time, but I want to take one more question, not least because it touches on other work that we've been doing in this space. So Megan Streb from Sustrans, I know you've asked a couple of questions. You've asked about a query on the relationship of density to intensification areas and or dormant areas, but that's not the question I want you to focus on, if you don't mind, because you also talked about areas of intensification in relation to public transport and PTAL. Can you just ask that question, because that gives us some sense as to where we might look within suburbs, particularly for opportunities. So Megan, are you there?
Yes, hello. Sorry for asking so many questions.
That's fine. Never apologize for asking questions, but that one is a particularly good one.
I wanted I think public transport is incredibly important in this, and it would be interesting to see how this overlays with existing public transport networks. But one of the other things that we're really focused on at Sustrans is the idea of a walkable neighborhood and thinking about access to shops and services, and whether or not actually we need to focus on that kind of proximity to shops and services, as well as looking at links to public transport.
Yeah, and that relates to a couple of questions that came up, obviously in the very specific context of the current pandemic, and whether densification or de-densification becomes more prominent or more problematic as we move beyond the very immediate crisis situation. So, Anthony, over to you.
A few things there. I think we took kind of an initial, we thought that public transport would be kind of a big driver of these patterns of densification, which we saw, which is where we saw some of the maps with train lines in particular. What we found is that in some of the bigger cities in particular, it does seem to be probably related to these kind of clusters, these pockets of very, very high density new supply. So like the Olympic Park, like Wembley, like Elephant and Castle, for instance. But apart from that, when you just look at ordinary kind of train stations or ordinary kind of tube stations, doesn't seem to be much connection. Like, if anything, the fact that those tube stations are often in places which are already suburban means that there's just that very, very little new development takes place in those locations. I think in terms of kind of what's that relationship between the provision of amenities and creating kind of walkable, kind of maybe 15-minute communities, as Hidalgo, the mayor of Paris, has suggested. I think you could do that within a very different institutional framework. So if you had like a flexible zoning system where people or kind of firms and kind of landowners and residents could change the use of their building much more easily and much more quickly without having to go for a kind of discretionary and uncertain planning permission process, you would find that amenities would be provided where people wanted the amenities to be. And I think that people want amenities to be within walking distance, within 5 to 10 minutes of where they live. But you wouldn't need quite as much kind of micromanagement from the local authority in setting up, this is where the high street's going to be, this is where kind of a secondary kind of shopping area is going to be. It would evolve and emerge much more naturally.
Okay, excellent. We're going to take one final question, because again, it's come up on several other questions as well. So I'm going to ask Stephen Ashworth. Is Stephen still on the call, on the video? He's got a question about how confident we are about the zoning system delivering, and how do you get from one system to the next? Stephen, are you there?
I am. I think you effectively said posed my challenge to Anthony, because I haven't seen a great deal of evidence from elsewhere that zoning systems do genuinely lead to a higher level of housing delivery, and certainly limited evidence that it leads to the densification of suburbs. It also comes with some practical difficulties in that moving from a discretionary system to a zoning system is always difficult and is litigious, and it builds into the system the very sort of inflexibilities in the long term that you are seeking to avoid. So you look at the system in the States and you end up with battles lasting years, if not decades in some cases, when you seek to rezone in the future. And trying to deal with that sort of issue, it strikes me as you're bringing down a whole host of new problems on your head, just as you're trying to solve the existing ones.
Okay, thank you very much, Stephen. So evidence that it creates more, and getting from one system to the next introduces a whole host of additional issues, never mind whatever the challenges are with any system. Anthony.
Yep. So I think Stephen's totally right that moving to a zoning system in and of itself does not fix the housing crisis. We know there's plenty of examples of zoning systems which don't work and which housing crises of their own. But I would say this is because the details of how you design the zoning system really, really do matter. And that it's possible to design a zoning system which doesn't result in a housing crisis, but it's not really possible to do that with a discretionary planning system. And my favorite example of this, as I mentioned in the talk, was Japan. And Japan has a much closer relationship between the supply of housing and the demand for housing. So I think back in kind of like 2012, 2013 or so, like Tokyo was building more houses every year than all of England was. And that then doesn't mean that places in the north of Japan or places in kind of poorer or lower demand areas are building as much housing. Those are places which are building much less housing, or even kind of zero new houses over this period. So the way in which their kind of flexible zoning system works, which then does result in much more affordable housing in Japan than it does in the UK, is because their kind of flexible zoning approach allows houses to be built in the places where there is demand. And there will be problems and issues which will emerge in that system, which we don't have in ours. But we can cross those bridges when we come to them, I think.